Here we go. Shalom, everyone. It is May the 2nd, 2022. We are talking about Parshat Kedoshim, and we've missed a couple of weeks, and we hope to get back into the rhythm of the weekly parsha after the disruption of Pesach. Just a little calendar note is that for the next several weeks, we are going to be out of sync with Israel. Israel is a parsha ahead of us because in Israel they did not observe the eighth day of Passover, and so the eighth day of Passover, which was for us on Shabbat, was the normal reading. That would have been the reading that we did this past Shabbat. So we're out of sync. Some would suggest that this is a kind of symbolic way of representing the relationship between Israel and the diaspora. I wouldn't go that far. I would say that this is one of the quirks of the calendar, and uh, some, of course, there are people who find the second days of Yontif very difficult. But just think of the extra Torah that we get to read because of the second day of Yontif. That's what I always like to say. At any rate, we are with Parshat Kedoshim. Parshat Kedoshim is a familiar parsha to us because it contains within it some of the basic commandments, the basic ethical commands of the Torah, and so you'll recognize many of them. And I'm just going to start by reading the first piece of it. Here we go. So Kedoshim to you, be holy. Vaydaber Adonai Moshe Limor. I'm just going to take out the spelling mistakes here. Okay, the red. So Vaydaber Adonai Moshe Limor. God spoke to Moses saying, I'll read it in English and you can follow along in Hebrew if you're able. Speak to the entire community of the children of Israel and say to them, holy are you to be, Kedoshim tiyu, right? Kedoshim tiyu, ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. For holy am I, ki kadosh ani Adonai Elohechem. Ki kadosh, that is holy, ani Adonai Elohechem. I am the Lord your God. And then some of the familiar commandments are, each man his mother and his father you are to hold in awe, and my Sabbaths you are to keep. I am God, the Lord your God. I'm using the Everett Fox translation, which is a very literal translation here. So this is the analog to honor your father and your mother, and of course it's each man his mother and your father you are to hold in awe. Ish imo vaviv tirau, and the commentators like to point out that with respect, it's respect your father and your mother, and it's with reverence, it's revere your mother and your father. Why the inversion with reverence? Because you naturally revere your father and you naturally respect your mother. So here, the one to whom you have the less natural inclination, you are commanded you take preference in the command. That of course is a debatable proposition, but that's how it's traditionally understood. I also point out the juxtaposition of the Sabbath rule in both these sets of commands in the Leviticus chapter, the Holiness Code it's called, and in the Ten Commandments, what we call the Ten Commandments, which we should really start saying the Ten Statements. And in Aseret Hadibrot, the two are juxtaposed. That is, they honor your father and your mother and remember the Sabbath. Here it's revere your father, your mother, and your father, and keep my Sabbaths. Et Shabtotai Tishmoru. And the traditional commentators point out that when your parents tell you to violate the Sabbath, you are actually not supposed to listen. At this point, this puts us into the conflict, the parental conflict with children regarding religious observance, and especially in families where uh, this phenomenon occurs where children become baalei tshuva and demonstrate piety, more piety than their parents. This is where the conflict emerges, and this is often cited as a proof text. And of course, sensitive rabbis, who counsel these situations ought to be very careful about this deploying this rule in these circumstances. Here are other kinds of other commandments. Do not turn your faces to no gods and molten gods. You are not to make for yourselves. I, the Lord, your God. Now, when you sacrifice a sacrifice of shalom to God for your being accepted, you are to sacrifice it. I'm going to skip around. The harvest, the vineyard. You are not to steal. Verse 11. You are not to lie. You're not to deal falsely, each man with his fellow. You are not to swear by my name falsely, thus profaning the name of your God. You are not to withhold your property from your neighbor. You are not to commit robbery. You are not to keep overnight the working wages of a hired hand with you until morning. You are not to insult the deaf before the blind. You are not to place a stumbling block. Rather, you are to hold your God in awe. I am the Lord. You're not to commit corruption, not to lift up in favor of the face of poor. You are not to traffic in slander. And then the final three of this chapter or this piece: you are not to hate your brother in your heart. Rebuke, yes, rebuke your fellow, that you not bear sin because of him. You are
Not to
not to
hate
take
your brother in
vengeance.
your heart.
You're not to take vengeance. You're not to retain anger against the sons of your kinspeople, but be loving to your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So there is the golden rule, or the verse that is often interpreted to be the source of the golden rule. Lo tikom velo titor p'nei amecha v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. Shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. And of course, we've studied this in the past in depth, and the multiple meanings that we derive from this are really important. Exactly what love your neighbor as yourself means, and what the obligations and the limits of the obligations are, or what are the boundaries of that, I think is a good subject of a conversation, but that's not the subject today. So the subject today, though, is the beginning, Kedoshim. You've heard me, use these words often. Of course, they become I'm going to stop to share for a second. You've heard me speak about Kedoshim, be holy, often. I've given a sermon that I've put on a T-shirt, right? Judaism can be boiled down into be a blessing, be holy, and choose life. Go study, of course, as an additional fourth injunction, and this condensation, or this compression of Judaism into a T-shirt slogan, I think is debatable, and that's a good debate to have. What does it mean to be Jewish? And of course, it's a long debate within the tradition. The tradition has always tried to boil down Judaism into its basic principles, and we have a number of Talmudic arguments about that. And even within the Torah itself, one can point to alternate versions of compressed ideas of Judaism. For example, right before the Sinai revelation, God says to me, "You shall be for me mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh," a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Some would take that as the compressed statement of what Judaism is from the Bible itself. Some would take the statement from Isaiah, "You should be or lagoyim, a light unto nations." Some would say that it is the Shema, for example, "Hear, O Israel, love the Lord your God." That could be a compressed statement as well. And again, that conversation is a long and unending conversation within Judaism, how we understand the basic tenets of Judaism. For example, would the Aseret HaDibrot, the 10 statements, be akin to a compressed version of Judaism, the basics? And the argument would be, of course, yes, it's 10. And if you live your life by the 10 statements, of course, you have the basics of a Jewish life. Um, and on we could go. But sometimes when we say the words "be holy," we really don't know what that means. I find myself even giving that sermon over and over again, and that lesson, be a blessing, be holy, choose life. Those three statements are great for a T-shirt or a bumper sticker, but what does it mean? What does being holy mean? We kind of have an idea of what being holy means. And because the word holy itself is a religious word, um, and it's an English religious word, it puts us off. We are overwhelmingly living as in a secular world with a secular language. So the religious nature of the language um, kind of sets us into this zone of we really don't know what this means. Um, we can identify what people hold as sacred when we realize what their reactions to things are, right? I was, we just talked about the defacement of the mural. There was a mural. My mother does not know. There's a mural in Highland Park just went up, and someone put a graffiti on it. So in one of the statements I saw, it was the
What did you say?
desecration, the
I can't
desecration of
hear
a
you.
mural, the desecration, right? So to use the word desecration related to a piece of secular art, I thought was pretty stunning. Okay, we don't desecrate a mural, rather than we deface it, or we vandalize it. Do you desecrate a monument? Because a monument is accorded a certain kind of sanctity within the civil sphere. So we have a monument in town, the Doughboy. It's a monument that commemorates already from the First World War, but it's Veterans Monument. And if someone were to deface that monument, it would be a desecration. Um, we have a shul. So if someone were to vandalize our shul, deface, many of the very, the blank walls that is ripe for defacement, God forbid. Would it be a desecration, a vandalization, or all sorts of things? The point is that societies hold certain things to be elevated and have place a greater value on them than other things. And when those things are violated, that is a sense of desecration. The most important example that came out in the secular environment of the last 2 years has been, of course, the January 6th storming of the Capitol, which you know is seen as a defilement and a desecration of here again. Is it a sacred space? It's a special place. It's a place that ought to have been protected from that kind of transgression, and the feeling of violation from that event, I think, still permeates to this day. And so that you can see, that's the closest that we can get to, quote unquote, a religious sense of what the holy is. That is to say, that kind of zone where profane acts do not take place, violence does not take place. It's protected, it's set off. And so we have that sense of the word holy. And so when that definition is applied to the people of Israel, to the Jewish people, we have to understand what that means. It means, on the one hand, to be set apart, and then on the other hand, it means to have certain kinds of behaviors that set us apart. And of course, what does it mean to be set apart? I would say that part of what we just read, the laws that follow in chapter 19 of the book of Leviticus, are an answer to the question, how is one to be holy? How does one demonstrate holiness? One demonstrates holiness by revering your parents, by honoring the Sabbath, by properly adjudicating cases, and on and on and on. And then finally, love your neighbor as yourself. It wouldn't surprise us that the commentaries and the tradition has a lot to say about this. Very, very much to say. And so we're going to go to that right now. Here we go. Okay, so be holy. And here I'm going to start off with just noting the obvious, that this rule found at the center of the book of Leviticus, which is the central book. Therefore, I'm saying it's the central principle. But we in the sequence of parshiot, we have moved from Achrei Mod, which was last week, which dealt with the purgation of the sanctuary on Yom Kippur, and a whole corpus of law dealing with what are forbidden relationships, forbidden sexual relationships. And so from then you have the laws of holiness. And that leads Rashi, I'm going to go back to Aviva Zornberg in a second, Rashi to say that what holiness means in the narrowest sense is to keep aloof from forbidden sexual relations. Hevu pirushim min ha'arayot. The sexual prohibitions, because the previous set of commandments dealt with sexual prohibitions, being holy at the very, very minimum is, there are certain kinds of relationships that are forbidden to you. And when you practice that kind of set of boundaries on the forbidden sexual relation, that's the way you become a holy nation. But he also includes here umin ha'avera, and that is to say, separate yourselves from sin. Okay, so he is saying it is evident that this is the meaning of Kedoshim to you, because shekol makom she'ata motze geder erva ata motze kedusha. Wherever you find in the Torah a command to fence yourself against such relations, you also find the mention of holiness. So it wouldn't surprise us in the least that the one thing that we zero in on is sexuality, and sexuality being such a core element of human self-understanding, that would be one of the defining features. And if you recall, we spoke about this to a certain extent last year, that part of what defines Israel's uniqueness in the context of Egypt and Canaan is that they practice their intimate lives in a different way, and that the tradition, as family-centered as it is primarily concerned about the vulnerability of individuals within the family setting, and enacts legislation with the harshest consequences to those who violate those sexual boundaries. Okay. All right. I'm going to go back to this statement. I drew a lot of inspiration for this class from the work of Aviva Zornberg. I'm just going to stop the share for a second and show you the book. I'm going to put myself in a spotlight for a second. So this book just came out. Aviva Zornberg is a very interesting author. She writes on the Torah, and she is a very popular lecturer in Jerusalem. Many hundreds and hundreds of people come to her lectures on the parasha, and she has put out, I think all books on every book of the Chumash at this point. They're very dense, very literate, lots of references to writers that most of us have not heard of. Even the most learned and the most educated of us, kind of like glaze over when any particular sentence. But sometimes she is intelligible. Sometimes this is what she looks like. For those of you who, so she's comes from an Orthodox background and is one of the most popular teachers now. So I like to delve into what she writes from time to time because, and here this is like the sub theme of this. The joy of the study of Torah is to see it from another person's eyes, and then to be surprised and edified by a different perspective with different associations that reveal new and often unintended or unforeseen, unanticipated meanings to the Torah. And that's part of the goal, or part of the challenge in reading her commentary, or frankly any commentary, is that in the process of reading these comments, we get a new perspective and we get new insight. And I think the delight of the study of Torah, which we read it every year. The delight is seeing a new insight into it, or getting a new insight. And she has, I think, a lot to share in that department. And so I'm going to provide a few of those insights today. So she says, like a pool of sunlight in a tangled forest, the demand of holiness moves us from a world of specific taboos, anomalies, and abomination to a blinding moment of aspiration. And here, this is the theme. The theme is that we're going from a very specific set of prohibitions relating to unions and relationships, and now we're moving into this blinding moment of aspiration. She writes, the difference in tone is unmistakable. In fact, if just by being present in the reading of the Torah from last week to this week, and reading, for example, the nakedness of your mother-in-law you shall not uncover, to love your neighbor as yourself, you already understand, without even having to explain it, that there's a total difference in tone, right? Do not be a talebearer in your community, as opposed to do not sleep with your sister. From forbidden acts, we turn to a positive state of being. Okay, we did the Rashi. The positive state of being is be holy. So there is a debate about what this means. Rashi, very narrow, being that it's the most it's a definition of how one conducts one's intimate life. Nachmanides, the Ramban, says as follows: that holiness is actually an aspiration to go beyond the letter of the law. And here, this having a different voice here to answer what does holiness mean brings out the possibility of a rich conversation. Nachmanides, Ramban, says as follows: in my opinion, this abstinence, that is to say, abstinence from sexual sins, does not refer only to restraints from acts of immorality, as Rashi wrote, but is rather the self-control mentioned throughout the Talmud, which confers upon those who practice it the name Perushim. Sheba'aleha nikri'im Prushim. The Pharisees are people who were Prushim. They separated themselves, or they practiced certain restraints. Those who are separated from self-indulgence, as will be explained. Va'inyan, the meaning thereof is as follows: the Torah has admonished us against immorality and forbidden foods. HaTorah hizhira ba'arayot, that is sexual immorality, uva ma'achalim asurim, and certain things are forbidden for us to eat. But vehitira, it permitted sexual intercourse between man and his wife, and eating of certain meat and wine. So, sex is permitted, and eating is permitted, right? Certain things, certain kinds of relationships are forbidden, and certain foods are forbidden. But here comes the obvious question, which is, okay, so if we're forbidden to have sex with certain individuals and permitted to have sex with other individuals, and if we're forbidden to eat certain foods but permitted to eat other foods, then wouldn't it be possible to have constant state of sex and a constant state of gluttony and eating, right? And that would be totally permitted, right? You could, in that sense, I'll just close the screen here for a second. In that sense, a person could be living a totally holy life if they have sex 16 times a day with their own spouse, or in antiquity it could be many spouses. And if they were eating, food constantly, just provided that it was kosher food, right? So you get the point here. The point is that what is holiness if you're allowed certain things? Holiness can't be just the permission and the prohibition of things. Holiness has to be a deeper thing than that. I just want to see if you have any comments about that. I'm going to just close my my thing here to, how do you do that? Remove spotlight. Go ahead. Go ahead. Any comments on this?
Rabbi?
Yes, go ahead.
I would read that as be holy, choose life.
Well, that's my
as opposed to be holy and choose life.
Yes.
Because when you choose life, when you go back to the sexual aspect of it and the eating aspect of it, there's no alternative.
Well, there is.
You're either alive or you're dead. I mean, there's no alternative life out here.
Well, let me challenge you on that, just for the sake of the challenge, which is there is an alternative to unbridled sexuality with one spouse, and that is celibacy, right? And there is an alternative to unbridled food, although you can't live without eating, but certain people do subsist on eating very little, right? And live monastically like monks, by eating just the bare minimum of what they need. There's what to be admired in that, in our particular environment where we have so much to choose from, and we see the results of that in our public health. But there are certain ways of living that are promoted as ideal and holy, but not by our tradition. So we wouldn't go as far as monasticism, that is, people who live as monks removed from society in celibate, in states of celibacy and depriving themselves of certain pleasures. Judaism is basically saying, and this is Nachmanides, he's saying, look, you absolutely have to live, but how you define the character of your life is really what this is about. This is what Zornberg is saying, and here we're going to focus on the theme. This is an aspirational statement. This is an ideal statement. This is what you are to aspire to. You're not to aspire to only live within the permitted relationship. Of course, that's the boundary. But how do you become the holy person, the holy people that you are to become, given the sets of boundaries that are placed upon you, and that's what he's really going for. And we'll see in a second. And I'm glad you mentioned, you connected the live by them. That the reason for this is interpreted as so that you will have a full and enriched life. That doing the mitzvot and being holy has as its ultimate predicate, its ultimate goal, the living of a meaningful, beautiful, and full life. Okay. Any other comments so far? Go ahead.
Rabbi, I do. It's Nanette. Rabbi?
Go ahead.
Okay. So, hey, Rabbi. So this all sounds great, of course. Should I be thinking about why am I reading about Noah in the Genesis? Remember, they covered his nakedness.
Yes.
Should I be making some sort of a connection, or how could I explain?
What you should do is look at last year's class, because we talked about it in last year. Go to the YouTube, have a whole discussion on this, and because there's the understanding that Canaan is a symbol of sexual depravity, and so there is the idea that Israel is to live a holy life based on how it conducts its intimate lives and also how it organizes its family. This seems to be what we take away from those rules from last week's parsha, that the family is organized on basic principles of who you cannot be with in intimate relations, and that's the cornerstone, the bedrock of the society. Okay, Canaan represents the blurring of all of those boundaries, and the exercise of power over those members of your household unit which would have been most vulnerable, namely, children and others who are typically vulnerable to predation, to sexual predation. Okay, Ilana, go ahead.
In the Bible, who would be an example for us to follow his being kadosh? Moshe, Aaron, Abraham. Who should we follow?
That's a great question. The fact that you mentioned Moshe, Moshe certainly is holy, but I wouldn't want to follow him, right? Aaron is certainly holy, but I wouldn't want, what we see in those characters, that those are, models, we see how difficult it is, right? And the challenge of being holy is difficult. The Bible, is Abraham holy? Is Isaac holy? Jacob, all of those, they're very complicated people, and of course that term, that adjective, is not applied to them. It applies here that the people are to live in a certain way. I think it's a fascinating question in terms of, how do you aspire? Moses is not a particularly family-oriented man. Moses, as you know, will have certain difficulties with, he's the leader, and so and he has two sons, and there's never any kind of narrative about Moses as a parent or even as a husband. Aaron has sons, and Aaron does have some relationship, and Aaron in the tradition emerges as an individual that is a loving and good and peace, inducing personality. But even Aaron is a problematic figure. Are the tribal chieftains are they emulate? Well, no. There is a certain aspiration within the ordinary. The aspiration for holiness is to the ordinary person. The ordinary person has to aspire to this. Go ahead, Bob. Yeah.
Would it be safe to say that holiness only arises out of relationships, such as marriage, or even when we talk about God, I am holy, does what you're saying apply as well to God?
I think so. I think that nails it. It's Judaism is a religion of relationships. I think that's the most accessible frame within which to understand Judaism, that it's based on all of these relationships, and that our relationship to God is a primary relationship, our relationship to each other, and then of course within relationships between individuals is the most important relationships, which are the relationships between spouses and the relationships between parents and children. Now, John, go ahead.
Just following up on what Rob said, that seems to be the importance of relationships. this seems to be Martin Buber's main point.
Yes, Martin Buber, in his famous philosophical work I and Thou, says, and I could sum it up in the one sense: behind every thou is the eternal thou, which means, if I relate to you in the totality of my being, in the experience of that relationship, there is an element of the divine. Okay. All right, let me go on, and we'll do some more Aviva Zornberg, and I'll show you what she says here. So, Nachmanides makes this point. We'll just review this. If so, a man of desire could consider this to be permission to be passionately addicted to sexual intercourse with his wife or many wives, and be among wine bibbers, among gluttonous eaters of flesh, and speak freely all profanities, since this prohibition has not been expressly mentioned in the Torah, and thus he will become a sordid person within the permissible realm of the Torah. This is the ethical problem. It's that you can do permitted things, but you can be a really awful person, even though you do everything according to the law. Therefore, after having listed the matters which he prohibited altogether, Scripture follows them up by a general command that we practice moderation even in matters which are permitted, such as the following: one should minimize sexual intercourse, so that the disciples of the sages should not be found together with their wives as often as the hens, and he should not engage in it except as required in fulfillment of the commandment thereof. He should also sanctify himself to self-control by using wine in small amounts, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so here we have one idea, Rashi, which is focused specifically on sexuality, and Ramban says, look, you need to think about life in general. Being holy is an attitude, an aspirational posture of moderation in everything in your life. It's a zemadhim, as they say in Israel. It's amazing, madhim. A Jew is commanded to aspire. This is from Rabbi Aaron Lichtenstein. And then we'll go into Zornberg again. Forging this connection between the human and the divine is the entire purpose of the Exodus. The Exodus, too, is an ongoing project. When we got so involved in the Exodus, we have to remember that the predicate of the Exodus was to make that relationship, and the relationship is the relationship of holiness. The Egyptian Exodus had and continues to have a spiritual purpose. Exodus is a fact to which values adhere. The motive for aspiration is ultimately a larger sense of life, and this is what Skip mentioned before. The purpose of the stringencies of law is v'chai bahem, so that you will live through them, or how we say, choosing life. The purpose of fulfilling the laws is increased vitality. If the laws do not have this enlivening effect, then they should be read otherwise. A human being experiences such wholeness in the development of her intellectual and spiritual capacities. For the Jew, this means the study of Torah and the aspiration toward love of God. Achieving that fullness of life is joy at its most intense. I'll just stop for 2 seconds here, which is to say that we get alive, we become alive. The laws are not only how to live and construct your lives, but the involvement intellectually and spiritually is what gives us joy and satisfaction, as we all experience when we study the Torah, when we kind of involve ourselves and communicate with each other and converse. It's deeply gratifying and very, very joyful. Okay, and what is even more joyful is learning different perspectives and trying to get different experiences for this. Just a couple of last word. Kadushakami understood as the aspiration towards such vitality, a kind of discomfort is a baseline, a restlessness about all given situations. Here, one is not yet who one wishes to be. One seeks out a deeper and larger way to be. I'll stop there. And then she goes on and talks about something else. I want to show this to you, and then get her. I in a million years would never have made the connection between Kedoshim to you and the following scene. The following scene is from the movie The Shawshank Redemption, which is an extraordinary movie, as you all know. I hope you've seen it. Many of you may have seen it more than once. The movie, based on a short novella by Stephen King, is about a fellow, Andy Dufresne, who is wrongly convicted for murder, is sentenced to a life imprisonment in a maximum security prison. And because of his financial knowledge, he becomes the warden's kind of pet inmate, and has access to the warden's files, etc. In the movie, he spends years digging a tunnel out of his cell to escape, and he escapes, and in the process exonerates himself and has the warden put in jail. It's such a great movie, beautifully filmed, and this is a scene. This is the Mozart scene. I had to watch it a couple times to remind myself of the scene. It's a scene in which the music comes. He's in the office, Andy. He's in the office and he sees the warden's record player and the record collection. That's the scene that you have in front of here. And so I bet you're wondering, what does this have to do with holiness? And I will explain right now. So this is where Torah.
Why interpreters want this instant translator device banned in the.
This is where Torah study becomes art. Just stop for a second. And it's as follows. Can you all see the text? Okay. So Aviva Zornberg writes as follows. I think of the Mozart scene in The Shawshank Redemption. Set in the brutal atmosphere of a maximum security prison, the prison yard is suddenly invaded by the sounds of a Mozart aria. The hero, Andy, in a transgressive act that earns him 2 weeks in solitary, has locked himself in the warden's office and is playing the aria over the hissing speakers of the prison. Everyone from prisoners to warders stops in his tracks. Routine is disrupted by the sheer fragile beauty of Mozart's music. Transfixed, every last man stands gazing upward. The experience is one of freedom, pure sound from elsewhere, from another place and another time, is delivered into the drab little cage of the prison. This scene, I suggest, provides an analogy for the uncanny phenomenon of holiness. Being or becoming holy is a function of being moved by a beauty that comes from elsewhere. The otherness of the holy evokes a kind of freedom. It is experienced in practices of bodily restraint and spiritual aliveness that help to carry one from one state of being to another yet unknown. Like classical music, it is usually deemed an elite interest, though its power, it turns out, can be felt by every last man. The practitioner is often marked out as exceptional, but here the Torah commands a whole nation, be holy, for I, God, am holy. Okay, so I want to just reread the second paragraph again because it takes a while for this to kind of seep in. The scene, I suggest, provides an analogy for the uncanny phenomenon of holiness. Being or becoming holy is a function of being moved by a beauty that comes from elsewhere, The otherness of the holy evokes a kind of freedom. It is experienced in practices of bodily restraint and spiritual aliveness that help to carry one from one state of being to another, yet unknown. Like classical music, it is usually deemed an elite interest, though its power, it turns out, can be felt by every last man. The practitioner is often marked out as exceptional, but here the Torah commands a whole nation, be holy, for I am God, am holy. So when I read that paragraph, of course, it made the lesson very accessible because, as I say often, we're in a very visual medium, and we need in this medium this kind of analogy and this kind of visual dialogue, especially with film, and brilliant film at that. But it takes a very, I think, sophisticated reader of the caliber of Aviva Zornberg to make that kind of connection, which I don't think that it would have ever occurred to anybody to make, which is that in the scene is an allegory. Okay, the scene is an allegory of what is free and who's in prison and who's not, right? So while the Andy's in prison, he is free the moment that he turns on the music. You saw the expression in his face, and he shares that freedom with all the inmates who are in prison, who are penned in, and very skillfully, the director has them stop. They pause and they look up. And what she's saying is that that's the she is drawing the analogy that it's coming from out there. It's coming from elsewhere. The call to be holy is not readily understood. The content of the music in its beauty and in its expression is not readily accessible, and needs to be experienced and needs to be internalized, because that itself creates in you the aspiration. When you hear the music, you are moved, and in being moved, you aspire to a certain state of being. Now, you don't live in that state of being in a constant state, constantly. We have our mundane lives, right? We're not always listening to the music and being taken to, that spiritual and aesthetic realm. But it is available to us, and it's not only an elite phenomenon, right? The big flaw that many of us make is that we think that, well, holiness and the experience of what the Torah is talking about is only for those who can practice it. And what she is saying here is that no, the direction to the people, it's to the people. And everyone acquires their aspiration wherever they are and whatever it means. And at a single moment, everybody is linked into this call, and they're refining themselves accordingly. And that is a very interesting analogy, an analogy that as I said, would never occur to me to do. But you can see that the music functions almost as like the divine voice, and the people function as the people, and the divine voice is being received by the people, and for one moment they're free, even in their imprisonment. And the analogy would be that existence and life, as complicated and challenging as it can be, requires that liberation, the sense that you can be pulled up out of the mundane aspects of human existence and elevated to a higher plane. And that's what Kedoshim is trying to tell us. Go ahead, Ruth. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm just thinking out loud here, and I don't know if this has anything to do with Kadosh, but I couldn't help but make the analogy. This week is Yom HaZikaron, and just as in the movie, everybody freezes when they hear Mozart and they're pulled out of what they're doing and they stop and they're transfixed. In Israel, when they have the sephirah, the siren, no matter what everybody's doing, they're pulled out of the moment and they're transfixed exactly like the movie. They're not brought to a higher level, but they're brought out of what they're doing to think about something else at another place and another time. And I just couldn't help but make the analogy, but I'm not sure what it means, if there's any connection.
I think the analogy is very powerful. I would put that as I read the paragraph and watched, that scene, I thought, well, are there other examples? And I couldn't really think of an example, but this is a wonderful example. There are experiences that, of where something comes from somewhere else and pulls you. And those of us who have been present during the sirens in Israel, where everything stops, people don't necessarily look up. They do look in. I think they do have a change of a state of emotion if they are attuned to it, and of course the call is a call of attunement to this. Unfortunately, not everyone would be attuned to it, but for the majority of people who are attuned and wait for this and find themselves at 10 o'clock on Yom HaShoah, whatever, and they make it a point that they will be attuned to that, and that the experience of the siren and the collective stop, the cessation of every single activity in Israel, where cars pull off the highway and the drivers stand by the side of their cars, that's a unique phenomenon. That is unique, and that is a different kind of holiness. It's the holiness that would be a subcategory, or solemnity would be. It wouldn't be what I would call ecstasy. It would be, in solemnity. Okay, so we got John and we got Bob. Go ahead, John.
Yeah. First of all, getting back to Zornberg, I think what she said and what you said is fantastic. I'm a little curious what the warden was doing, having Mozart in the office there. Didn't really seem to fit. But what she's saying, I think, is that the aesthetic can lead to the ethical, and it's kind of an epiphany, and it's somewhat, I think, similar, to what Heschel says when he talks about radical amazement, because you could have an experience of like radical amazement listening to Mozart, something that's otherworldly, and I think that's what was happening in the movie.
All right, so this is a great subject. We could have a real debate about this, because while on the one hand, and I think it's quite interesting that he does have Mozart in his office, having just observed Yom HaShoah, we of course know that some of the cruelest people in the world were themselves motivated by high art. I just need to recall two books that I read last year by Philippe Sands. East West Street is one of them, and I forget the name of the other. In which he talks about the governor of the general government district in Poland, who when he took over the quarters in which he and his family lived, he requisitioned a Leonardo da Vinci painting from the National Museum of Poland, and had it installed over his dining room. So here he took the masterpiece of Da Vinci and put it. The Nazis, of course, were high worshippers of art. So I mean, we would be skeptical of the role and the value of aesthetics in the cultivation of the moral personality. Notwithstanding that, we shouldn't denigrate the idea that aesthetics can lead to a different caliber of human experience. It's just not necessarily the moral experience, and that I think is a great subject of discussion. Bob.
I just wanted to add a caveat, and I was glad that the lyrics were left out in just playing the music, because if you've ever listened to Don Giovanni, it doesn't at all fit with the conquests of women and other things with what one would read in Leviticus by all of that. And so I think that the question of whether music, as beautiful as Mozart is automatically something about holiness, can be asked questions. I also wanted to say I read something very interesting from a Hasidic perspective, that the rabbis teach that Hashem created the world with 10 utterances, and Bereshit, if you rearrange the letters, it spells Shirat Av, or the song of our fathers, and the idea that each of us ourselves are musical notes.
Yeah, that's very lovely, and we'll leave it to the Hasidim to create a new poetry around the configuration of the letters and their mystical meanings. I think that we can disclose many layers of meaning around these texts and these experiences with the central ideas. And at what point does the aesthetic enliven us and lift us up to new understandings of reality? Okay. So holiness then is set of behaviors. It's also moderation, according to Nachmanides, but it's also aspiration. And the key, and it's a long way to get to that punchline, but the statement in Leviticus then, and I should amend my little speech on this, is that it's maybe not amended, it's embedded in the idea, which is you aspire to this. You are to lift yourself out of the mundane into a different level of awareness and a different state of being. And that's what Leviticus is saying it means to be a Jew. To be a Jew is to be constantly engaged in this aspirational quest, to lift yourself from the mundane to something that is not only spiritual, but a different kind of existence where the body, where the mind, where the entire experience of life is not just ordinary, it's extraordinary and it's special and it's uniquely informed by knowledge and feeling and emotion and the quest for a relationship, as we have said, with God. And I think that that's what Kedoshim means. We got it. Okay. Finally. All right.